The bell tower swayed like a ship's mast caught in a gale. As Hazel Pritchard pressed herself against the rain-soaked timber, her fingers white around the red wool skirt she'd been trying to hang, as a distress signal. 20 feet below, what had been Red Oak, Colorado territory the summer of 1874's main street just hours before, now churned with muddy water, carrying away the remnants of lives, a child's wooden toy fragments of the general store's front porch, Mrs. Chen's prized rocking chair spinning in the current, like driftwood. As she watched her world disappear beneath the flood, Hazel's mind went to another moment of devastation 5 years earlier. She'd been 23 then, standing in a Baltimore cemetery beside her parents' graves, holding her medical degree in hands that trembled with more than grief. The cholera epidemic had taken them both within a week, but not before she'd learned that even her father's progressive views had limits. A woman doctor belongs in a parlor, not an operating theater. He'd wheezed on his deathbed, fever burning away his usual diplomacy. She'd proven him wrong by saving 3 patients he couldn't, but the victory felt hollow when weighed against his disappointment. That memory had driven her west, seeking a place where skill mattered more than convention. Red Oak had accepted her grudgingly at first, until the winter of '74, when she delivered Jonas Pike's breech-born son during a blizzard that kept the nearest male physician snowed in 50 miles away. Word of her competence had spread slowly but surely, building the practice that now lay drowning beneath her feet. "Sign the papers, Miss Pritchard." Jedediah Cull's voice cut through the howling wind with predatory certainty. The land speculator stood 4 feet away, his expensive wool coat torn and filthy from the climb, but his pale gray eyes held the same calculating hunger that had made him wealthy, buying up defaulted homesteads across the territory. Water dripped steadily from his beaver hat as he held out a leather portfolio, its contents protected by oiled cloth. Hazel studied his face with the clinical detachment she'd learned during her medical training. Dilated pupils despite the dim light, slight tremor in his left hand, elevated breathing signs of a man operating under extreme stress, making desperate decisions. The knowledge gave her no comfort. Desperate men were the most dangerous. "The debt isn't due until Christmas," she managed, though her voice carried no conviction. They both knew dates meant nothing when half the town lay buried under mountain runoff. Cull stepped closer, and the ancient tower groaned like a dying animal. "Christmas. Look around you, woman. There won't be a Christmas for Red Oak. The federal marshal's been delayed by washouts clear to Denver. No law coming for weeks." He reached inside his coat and withdrew a small silver derringer, not pointing it at her, but ensuring she could see its polished surface gleaming despite the storm's darkness. "Your building, your medicines, your equipment, all of it passes to me for debt settlement. Legal and proper." His thin lips curved in what might have been a smile on a kinder face. "Unless you have something else to offer. A marriage contract, perhaps. Settle the obligation through more personal arrangements." The words hit Hazel like a physical blow. She'd known Cull coveted her property. The apothecary sat on one of Red Oak's few stone foundations built over an old trading post. But she'd never imagined he'd use natural disaster to force such terms. The clinical part of her mind noted his strategy: isolate the victim. Apply pressure at the moment of maximum vulnerability, offer a solution that seemed preferable to complete destruction. "I need time to consider." "Time's what you don't have." Cull's grip tightened on the derringer, and she could see his knuckles had gone white beneath the worn leather of his gloves. "Sign willing, or I let nature solve my problems. Either way, come morning, I own what's left." Hazel looked down at the swirling water, 20 feet below, then at the red skirt in her hands, her signal to any soul brave enough to venture rescue in this chaos. People throughout Red Oak were counting on that signal. Mrs. Patterson trapped on her roof with 3 children. old Henrik clinging to his overturned wagon. The Brennan boy last seen scrambling toward higher ground when the wall of water hit. The weight of their need pressed against her chest like a stone. She'd taken an oath to preserve life, to heal rather than harm. How could she abandon that responsibility to preserve her own freedom? Yet, how could she help anyone if she became Cull's property? Stop. The words scraped from her throat like gravel. She straightened, meeting Cull's triumphant gaze with as much dignity as she could muster. Stop. I'll sign a marriage contract. Settle the debt that way. Cull's eyes lit with predatory satisfaction, but before he could respond, a new voice cut through the storm, calm, quiet, and somehow more dangerous than the howling wind. Put the gun down. Both Hazel and Cull spun toward the sound. A man had appeared at the ladder's edge with fluid grace that suggested years of moving through dangerous territory undetected. Perhaps 32 years old, with straight black hair plastered against his skull by the relentless rain and skin the color of burnished copper. His bare chest bore fresh scratches, and blood streaked his ribs, whether his own or from someone he'd pulled from the flood, Hazel couldn't tell. Most arresting were his eyes, winter dark but alert, taking in the scene with a hunter's patient assessment. They fixed on Cull's derringer with calm interest that suggested familiarity with violence. I said, "Put it down." The stranger repeated his voice, carrying the subtle accent Hazel recognized as Cheyenne. "Nobody needs holes in the roof." Cull's face flushed red above his sodden collar. "This is private business, Indian. Move along before you get hurt." The stranger's gaze shifted to Hazel, and she felt as if he were reading something written in her expression, fear certainly, but also determination, and the kind of steady courage that came from years of making life and death decisions under pressure. His attention dropped to the leather medical satchel at her feet, waterlogged but intact. "That bag has something belongs to my people," he said, speaking directly to her with quiet authority. Hazel blinked through the rain confusion cutting through her terror. "I don't understand." "These are medical supplies, herbs I gathered myself from the mountain meadows." "The journal." His voice remained level, but something flickered behind those dark eyes grief held under iron control. Leather cover, brass clasp. Pages filled with plant drawings and territorial markers. My sister's work. The blood drained from Hazel's face as understanding hit her like a physical blow. She did possess such a journal purchased 4 months ago from a traveling trader who claimed it contained valuable botanical knowledge from a deceased Cheyenne healer. The intricate drawings had helped her identify several medicinal plants she'd never encountered before, expanding her practice considerably. But if it had been stolen from a grave? "Your sister, Wiyaka Redhawk. She died 2 winters past." His voice stayed controlled, but Hazel caught the undercurrent of carefully banked rage that spoke of injustices long endured. "Journal was buried with her, according to our customs. Shouldn't be in white hands." Cull raised his derringer, pointing it directly at the stranger's chest. "I don't give a damn about your heathen customs or dead relatives." This woman's signing papers then were leaving. What happened next unfolded in the space between heartbeats, with the kind of explosive violence that Hazel had seen in operating theaters when patients' bodies suddenly rebelled against all efforts to save them. She moved first, driven by instinct, honed through years of emergency medicine. Her hand shot out, grabbing the bell rope and looping it around Cull's gun wrist in one fluid motion. As the land speculator's attention jerked toward her in surprise, she yanked hard with all the strength built up through years of handling struggling patients and heavy medical equipment. The rope snapped taut with a sound like breaking bone. Cull's hand slammed against the wooden railing with sickening force, his fingers spasming open involuntarily. The derringer discharged wild into the storm-dark sky, its report lost in thunder as the weapon spun away into the churning water below. The Cheyenne man moved like lightning, given human form, his bare foot connecting with Cull's already injured wrist in a strike that was both precise and economical. The land speculator doubled over with a scream of agony, clutching his damaged hand against his chest. For a moment, the three of them stood frozen in a triangle of mutual wariness. Cull, nursing his injuries, his face twisted with pain and murderous fury. The stranger watching them both with the supernatural stillness of a predator assessing threats. And Hazel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, caught between relief and the sudden realization that she'd just declared war on one of the territory's most powerful men. "You made a grave mistake, Indian." Cull snarled through gritted teeth, spittle flying from his lips. "Sergeant Archer's got men posted throughout the valley. When they hear about this assault on a white citizen..." The stranger's expression didn't change by so much as a flicker, but Hazel noticed his hands clench almost imperceptibly at mention of the sergeant's name. Something passed across his weathered features, recognition mixed with a hatred so pure it made her shiver despite the storm's warmth. "Let them come," he said with deadly simplicity. The tower shuddered again, more violently this time, and somewhere below them, a support timber groaned ominously. Through gaps in the floorboards, Hazel could see the water continuing to rise, carrying with it pieces of lives and livelihoods that would never be recovered. They needed to get down immediately, needed to help the people trapped throughout Red Oak's flooded streets. She bent and retrieved her medical satchel, water streaming from its saturated leather sides. Her fingers found the journal's familiar weight inside its brass clasp, cool and solid against her palm. Looking up at the stranger, she saw something in his weathered face that made her chest tight, grief so raw and terrible it was like looking into an open wound. The clinical part of her mind noted the signs, the way he held his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands when he wasn't actively controlling them, and the carefully neutral expression that didn't quite mask the pain burning behind his eyes. This was a man carrying trauma that went far deeper than simple loss. "You take it," she said, pulling the journal free and holding it toward him with both hands. "But help me save these people first. They're counting on us." The man Maddo, she somehow knew his name, though he hadn't spoken. It studied her face for a long, measuring moment. In that look, she felt him taking her complete measure, the way she might assess a patient's condition quickly and thoroughly, deciding whether she could be trusted with something precious and irreplaceable. "Deal," he said finally, accepting the journal but not opening it. Instead, he tucked it carefully inside his shirt against his heart, where it would be protected from the elements. "But we go now. This structure won't hold much longer." As if summoned by his words, another violent tremor ran through the ancient bell tower. Cull, still clutching his injured wrist, scrambled toward the ladder with desperate haste. "This isn't finished, Pritchard." He called back over his shoulder, his voice carrying promises of retribution that chilled her more than the mountain air. "Flood won't last forever. When the water recedes, I'll still have my legal papers, and you'll still owe me what's mine." Then he was gone, disappearing down into the chaos below, with the agility of a man accustomed to retreating when circumstances turned against him. Hazel could hear him calling for his men, his voice already fading as he made his way toward higher ground. Maddo waited at the ladder's edge, testing its stability with careful hands before committing his weight to the descent. "Can you swim? Well enough for frontier standards." Hazel secured her medical satchel across her shoulders with practiced efficiency and grabbed the signal rope she'd been trying to hang. It was frayed from their struggle, but might still serve its purpose. "There's a family trapped on the mercantile roof, Mrs. Chen and her 3 grandchildren. and I heard someone calling for help from the direction of the blacksmith shop. I saw the children during my approach. Approval colored his voice, and she caught a glimpse of something that might have been admiration in his dark eyes. You were signaling for rescue operations. Someone has to take responsibility. Hazel swung her leg over the ladder's edge, then paused to meet his gaze directly. Your sister's journal, the plants she documented. They're medicinal herbs, aren't they? Wiyaka was a healer, he said quietly, and for the first time since she'd met him, his carefully controlled expression softened slightly. Like you appear to be. Something in his tone made her study his face more carefully. Standing there with storm wind whipping his long hair and his sister's journal pressed against his chest, he looked like something from an older, wilder time. A warrior from the days when the world ran on different rules and justice was simpler to obtain. But his eyes, when they met hers, were entirely focused on the present crisis and the lives that hung in the balance. We saved them first, he said with quiet finality. Then we discussed justice for the dead. The descent proved treacherous beyond anything Hazel had experienced in her years of frontier medicine. The ladder rungs were slick with floodwater and rain, forcing them to climb down slowly, despite the tower's increasing instability. Every few feet the structure would shudder and sway, reminding them that their refuge could collapse at any moment. Halfway down, Hazel heard a child's voice crying for help, thin and desperate, cutting through the storm's howl like a knife through cloth. The sound came from somewhere near the church's foundation, where the floodwater had risen high enough to trap whoever was calling. There, she pointed, fighting to maintain her grip on the wet rungs as the tower swayed. By the side entrance. A small figure clung desperately to a partially submerged window ledge, a boy of perhaps 9 years old, his face pale with exhaustion and terror. The rising water had made it impossible for him to reach solid ground, but the window opening was too narrow to allow retreat back inside the building. Without hesitation, Matto dropped the remaining distance into the floodwater, reaching nearly to his shoulders. The current immediately tried to pull him toward the main channel, but he braced himself against the church's stone foundation and looked up at Hazel with steady confidence. I'll catch you, he said, extending his arms toward her. Such simple words, but as Hazel looked down at this man she'd met mere minutes ago, she realized they represented a leap of faith that went far beyond physical trust. She was placing her life in the hands of someone she knew nothing about, except that he'd chosen to help rather than harm when the opportunity arose. She let go. His hands closed around her waist as she hit the water strong and sure despite the treacherous current. He held her steady until she found secure footing on the submerged street, his grip lingering just long enough to ensure she was truly stable. The water was shockingly cold and far stronger than she'd anticipated from her view above. It tried constantly to sweep her toward the main channel where debris spun like deadly carnival rides, broken furniture, pieces of buildings, and worse things she preferred not to identify in the murky brown torrent. Stay close, Matto instructed, then began wading toward the trapped child with determined purpose. The boy saw them coming and cried out in desperate relief, his voice cracking with exhaustion. Please, help me. I can't hold on much longer. My hands are slipping. Hazel reached him first, her smaller frame allowing her to navigate closer to the building's foundation where the current was slightly less treacherous. But as she stretched toward the child, her boot slipped on something hidden beneath the surface, a loose cobblestone or piece of submerged timber, and the full force of the current seized her. For one terrifying heartbeat, she felt herself being pulled away from the building toward the deeper water, where the flood ran fastest and most dangerously. Her medical training kicked in, automatically cataloging the ways drowning could kill: cold water shock, debris, impact, simple exhaustion, when muscles gave out from fighting the current. Then Matto's hand closed around her wrist, his grip iron strong and absolutely certain. I have you, he said, And despite everything, the chaos surrounding them, the danger they faced, the uncertainty of their situation, she believed him completely. Together, they formed a human anchor chain, with Matto braced against the church's stone wall, while Hazel stretched toward the frightened boy. When their fingers finally connected his small hand, cold and slippery with fear and floodwater, she felt a surge of fierce triumph that reminded her why she'd chosen medicine over safer pursuits back east. "Let go of the window," she told him, her voice carrying the gentle authority she'd learned in treating frightened patients. "We'll pull you to safety, I promise." The transfer proved awkward and dangerous, complicated by the swirling water and the boy's understandable panic. But finally, blessedly, she had him secure in her arms, wet and shivering, but very much alive. As they began the careful journey back toward higher ground, Hazel became acutely aware of Matto's presence beside her in ways that transcended the immediate crisis. When the current pushed at her, threatening to sweep all three of them downstream, he was there instantly, his body forming an effective windbreak against the flow. When her footing slipped again on the uncertain bottom, his free hand found her elbow with unerring accuracy, providing stability without a word of communication between them. Their movements fell into an instinctive rhythm that seemed to develop without conscious planning step, carefully paused to check the boy's condition, and their positioning step again. Once, when a large piece of broken timber came spinning toward them out of the murky darkness, Matto's arms swept protectively across her body, deflecting the debris without breaking their forward momentum or losing his grip on her arm. It was only when they finally reached dry ground near the schoolhouse that Hazel realized how naturally their hands had remained connected throughout the entire rescue. Her fingers locked with his in a grip that spoke a language neither of them had words for yet, but both seemed to understand instinctively. "Thank you," she said as she carefully set the boy down on solid earth, her voice rough with exhaustion and relief. "Both of you. I couldn't have managed alone." A woman came running from the schoolhouse before the boy could respond, his mother, judging by her tears of overwhelming relief, and the way she gathered him into her arms, as if she would never let him go again. Her gratitude was wordless, but profound, expressed in the kind of look that reminded Hazel why she'd chosen to practice medicine, despite all the obstacles society placed in her path. Matto nodded acknowledgement of her thanks, but his attention was already shifting to other calls for help, echoing across the flooded settlement. "More people need assistance," he said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to crisis situations. "Yes." Hazel looked back toward the water, mentally cataloging the voices and trying to judge distances and degrees of urgency with the clinical assessment skills her medical training had drilled into her. "Mrs. Chen and her grandchildren are still on the mercantile roof, and I can hear someone calling from the direction of Pike's farm." They worked together for the next 4 hours, moving through flood-darkened red oak, like a team that had been partnered for years rather than minutes. Matto's physical strength and sure footing in the treacherous current complemented Hazel's medical knowledge and intimate familiarity with the town's layout in ways that seemed almost too perfect to be coincidental. When they pulled Jonas Pike from the wreckage of his overturned supply wagon, it was Hazel who immediately diagnosed his dislocated shoulder and provided clear instructions for treatment, while Matto supplied the steady leverage and careful positioning needed to relocate the joint without causing additional damage. When they found Mrs. Chen's elderly neighbor unconscious from exposure, it was Matto who carried the man to safety, while Hazel applied her knowledge of hypothermia treatment to restore his circulation and breathing. By the time the floodwater began its gradual retreat with the approaching dawn, and they had helped rescue 17 people and treated nearly twice that many for various injuries. More importantly, they had established something between them that went far deeper than simple cooperation, a foundation of absolute trust, built on shared purpose and proven competence under pressure. Dawn came pale and reluctant over Red Oak's transformed landscape, revealing a community that existed now primarily in memory, and the stubborn determination of its survivors. The flood had scoured Main Street completely clean in some places, while burying others under 3 feet of brown silt mixed with debris that would take months to clear. Buildings that had stood since the earliest territorial days were simply gone, leaving only scattered foundation stones to mark where families had lived and worked and built their dreams. Hazel stood in the doorway of what had been her apothecary, surveying the destruction, with a heart that felt heavy as lead in her chest. The flood had reached nearly to the ceiling, destroying most of her carefully prepared medicines and delicate equipment. Broken glass crunched under her boots as she picked her way through the debris, searching for anything that might be salvaged from the ruin of her life's work. Her mind went unbidden to the early days of her practice, when she'd spent her savings on equipment that male physicians took for granted. The brass microscope that had cost her a month's income, now twisted and mud-filled beyond repair. The surgical instruments her father had given her upon graduation, scattered and rusted. The carefully labeled bottles of medicines she'd prepared according to formulas, learned through years of study and experimentation, and their contents now part of the brown sludge coating everything. But worse than the material losses was the knowledge that she'd built something important here, a practice that served people who had nowhere else to turn for medical care. Pregnant women who couldn't afford the male physicians in larger towns. Children whose parents trusted her gentle hands more than the rough treatment they'd received elsewhere. Even the occasional Cheyenne brave who would swallow his pride long enough to accept healing from white hands drawn by word that this particular healer treated all patients with equal skill and respect. Could be worse, Maddow observed from behind her, his voice carrying a note of understanding that suggested he'd experienced his own share of devastating losses. He'd found a rough work shirt somewhere too large and patched in several places, but it covered the scratches on his chest. His sister's journal was visible as a rectangular bulge beneath the fabric pressed close to his heart. How could it possibly be worse? Hazel's voice carried more bitterness than she'd intended, years of frustration and disappointment bleeding through her usually professional composure. I've lost everything I worked for. My medicines, my equipment, my patients' trust. And Cull was right about one thing: without federal oversight, he can do whatever he pleases with complete legal impunity. Maddow moved deeper into the ruined shop, his boots making soft squelching sounds in the mud that covered everything like a brown shroud. You saved lives last night. That has to count for something substantial. Does it tell that to Mrs. Patterson when her rheumatism acts up again and I have no willow bark extract to ease her pain? Tell that to little Mary Chen when her lung fever returns and I can't treat it properly because all my respiratory medicines are gone. Tell them yourself, Maddow said, his voice carrying a note of gentle challenge. You're not dead. You're not broken beyond repair. You can rebuild what was lost. Hazel looked at him sharply, anger flaring in her chest like a suddenly kindled fire. With what resources? What capital Cull owns my debt obligations? And after what happened in the tower? She trailed off, remembering the cold fury in the land speculator's pale eyes, the casual way he'd drawn his weapon, the promises of retribution in his parting words. After what happened in the tower, he knows you're not helpless prey to be taken without consequence. Maddow said quietly, his dark eyes holding hers with steady intensity. That knowledge changes the entire dynamic of your relationship. Before Hazel could formulate a response to that observation, the sound of many horses reached them from the street iron-shod hooves, moving at military precision through the mud and debris. Through her broken front window, she could see a column of blue-uniformed cavalry approaching their mounts, stepping carefully through the wreckage, with the disciplined caution of professional soldiers. At their head rode Jedediah Cull, looking remarkably clean and well-groomed for a man who'd spent the previous night in disaster conditions. His injured wrist was bound in clean white bandage, and his expression held the satisfied air of a man whose plans were proceeding exactly as intended, despite temporary setbacks. Beside him rode a sergeant with weathered features and cold blue eyes that surveyed the destruction around them with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction rather than appropriate concern for the suffering of American citizens. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing rigidly military, and his attention moved across the scene with the calculating assessment of someone looking for opportunities rather than ways to help. "Sergeant Bo Archer," Hazel murmured, recognizing the man from his occasional visits to town for military supplies and territorial business. He was perhaps 38 years old, with the rigid bearing of a career soldier and a well-established reputation for strict adherence to regulations, particularly those that served his own interests or could be interpreted to support predetermined conclusions. Matto had gone absolutely still beside her, his attention fixed on the approaching riders with an intensity that made her skin prickle with warning. When she glanced at his profile, his face had become a carefully neutral mask, but she could feel danger radiating from him like heat from a forge. "What is it?" she whispered, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond the shop's walls. "Nothing," Matto said, but his voice had changed, become flat and controlled in a way that suggested barely leashed violence waiting for the right moment to break free. "Nothing yet." The soldiers drew rein directly in front of the apothecary, their horses stamping and snorting from the long ride through difficult terrain. Cull dismounted with theatrical flourish, his boots splashing in the muddy street as he approached the broken doorway, with an expression of false concern written across his features. "Miss Pritchard." He called out his voice, carrying just the right note of relief and gratitude. "Thank Providence you survived the night safely. When I couldn't locate you after that regrettable incident in the bell tower." He spread his hands in a gesture of heartfelt concern that would have been convincing if she hadn't seen the cold calculation in his eyes just hours before. Sergeant Archer remained mounted, but his pale eyes swept over the interior of the ruined shop, with professional assessment that missed no detail. When his gaze fell on Matto, it lingered with the particular attention soldiers gave to potential threats, cataloging posture positioning, and probable capabilities with automatic efficiency. "This the Indian who gave you trouble last night?" Archer asked Cull, his voice carrying the casual authority of military rank and territorial law enforcement. "The very same." Cull replied, smoothly, confidence returning to his manner now that he had official backing. "Assaulted me without provocation, threatened a defenseless woman during a natural disaster. I'd say that warrants immediate detention and investigation, wouldn't you agree?" "Sergeant..." Hazel stepped forward before Matto could respond, anger blazing in her chest like a bonfire fed by years of accumulated frustration with men who used authority to intimidate rather than protect. "That's an outright lie, and you know it. This man helped rescue people from the floodwater. Without his assistance, half the town would have drowned while you were safely on high ground." Archer's expression didn't change by so much as a flicker, his face maintaining the kind of bureaucratic neutrality that she'd learned to distrust in her dealings with territorial officials. "That may well be true, miss. But assault on a civilian during a territorial emergency is still assault regardless of subsequent good deeds. And harboring a potentially fugitive Indian without proper documentation..." He let the implication hang in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. "Fugitive? What fugitive charges? He's done nothing wrong except risk his own life to save others." "Documentation," Archer said, simply extending his gloved hand toward Matto with bureaucratic efficiency. "Reservation travel pass, scout papers, or written permission from the agency." The casual cruelty of his words made Hazel's stomach turn with disgust, but Matto's expression didn't change by even the slightest degree. He reached slowly into his shirt pocket and withdrew a folded document, handing it up to the sergeant, with hands that remained perfectly steady despite the insult. Archer examined the papers with exaggerated thoroughness, holding them up to catch the morning light and studying every line with the kind of attention that suggested he was hoping to find some irregularity that would justify harsh action. Maddo Redhawk, registered territorial scout currently unassigned to any specific military unit. He looked down at Maddo with something that might have been disappointment. Everything appears to be in proper legal order. Cull's face darkened like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. What about the assault charges, the threatening behavior toward a white woman? What assault? Hazel demanded hotly her medical training and precise observation, making her testimony that much more compelling. I witnessed the entire incident. You drew a weapon on me, first making threats about marriage contracts and debt collection. This man was defending himself and others from your illegal coercion. Your word against mine, Cull said with smooth confidence, the assurance of a man accustomed to having his version of events accepted without question. And I have witnesses who will testify to a very different sequence of events when the proper time comes. Archer folded Maddo's papers with military precision and handed them back, his movements deliberate and controlled. As it happens, territorial law grants me considerable emergency authority in disaster situations like this one. Until proper civilian authority can be restored and federal oversight established, I'll be personally overseeing all recovery efforts in this region. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather-bound ledger, its pages protected by waterproof oiled cloth wrapping. Mr. Cull has been extremely helpful in providing comprehensive documentation regarding property ownership and outstanding financial obligations. This information will prove invaluable in determining salvage priorities and resource allocation during the recovery process. Hazel felt the bottom drop out of her world as understanding hit her with the force of a physical blow. Salvage priorities. Limited resources require difficult choices, miss. Archer explained with the kind of cold practicality that chilled her blood more than the mountain air ever could. We can't possibly restore everything immediately. Priority must be given to properties with clear ownership, settled debts, and proper legal standing. His pale eyes fixed on hers with predatory focus. Your establishment appears to have some significant irregularities in its financial documentation. What irregularities? She asked, though she suspected she already knew what fabricated problems they intended to present. Cull stepped forward, eagerly producing his own leather portfolio with the enthusiasm of a man finally able to spring his carefully prepared trap. Missed debt payments, property maintenance violations, questions about medical licensing authority beyond approved territorial guidelines. His smile was sharp as a broken bottle. All serious matters, but nothing that can't be resolved with proper cooperation and understanding. The threat was as clear as mountain water. Sign his papers, accept his terms, or lose everything to bureaucratic manipulation backed by military authority. Hazel looked around her ruined shop, taking in the destruction that represented years of careful work, then at the soldiers who would enforce whatever Archer decided constituted territorial law. I need time to review these alleged irregularities and prepare a proper legal response, she said finally, trying to maintain some dignity in the face of obviously rigged proceedings. Time's a luxury we can't afford during emergency recovery operations. Archer replied without a trace of sympathy in his voice. Reconstruction efforts begin immediately. Properties not properly claimed and documented by close of business today will be added to the territorial emergency auction for immediate disposal. He wheeled his horse around with military precision, but paused before riding away to deliver his parting threat. Oh, and Miss Pritchard, you might want to reconsider your choice of associates. Emergency authority or not, I can't guarantee everyone's safety if there's continued trouble with unregistered individuals who don't understand their proper place in territorial society. The threat was ostensibly directed at Maddo, but the underlying message was clearly intended for her. cooperate with their demands, or people she cared about, would suffer the consequences of her defiance. As the soldiers rode away in a cloud of dust and jingling harness leather, Hazel found herself alone with Maddow, among the ruins of everything she'd worked to build. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice directly, but both understood perfectly. "They'll kill you if I don't surrender to their demands," she said finally, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "Possibly," Maddow replied, his voice remaining calm, despite the very real danger they both faced. She could see tension in the set of his shoulders, the way his hand rested near the knife at his belt. But his manner suggested a man accustomed to facing death with steady nerves. But not today. Too many witnesses present too much attention from surviving townspeople who might ask uncomfortable questions. "What about tomorrow next week?" Hazel kicked at a piece of broken pottery, watching it skitter across the muddy floor with bitter frustration. "I can't protect you from military authority backed by territorial law. I can barely protect myself from legal manipulation." Maddow moved to the window, gazing out at the street where the soldiers had disappeared, his silhouette dark against the morning light. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note she hadn't heard before. Something between profound grief and carefully controlled rage that spoke of injustices that went far deeper than their current predicament. "My sister Wiyaka was murdered 2 winters ago," he said without turning around, his words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "Traders found her body beside the Smoky Hill River, her grave torn open, her sacred belongings scattered like worthless refuse." He turned to face Hazel directly, and she saw something terrible burning in those dark eyes. Sergeant Archer was commanding the patrol that discovered her remains. He claimed it was wolf predation, natural scavenging after death. Hazel's breath caught in her throat as the implications hit her. "But you don't believe that official conclusion. Wolves don't steal journals containing detailed territorial surveys. They don't take brass hair ornaments or beaded medicine bags that might have value to collectors. They don't arrange surveyors' stones in geometric patterns around disturbed graves." Maddow's hand went unconsciously to his shirt, touching the hidden journal with reverent care. "And they certainly don't leave distinctive military boot prints pressed into sacred burial ground." "You think Archer killed her personally?" "I think Archer knows exactly who was responsible for her death. And I believe that journal contains information worth murdering for." Maddow's gaze moved to the window, where Cull's men were visible in the distance, setting up some kind of operation near the old Territorial Claims Office, something Mr. Cull desires desperately enough to risk everything he's worked to build. The pieces began falling into place in Hazel's mind, with sickening clarity, like symptoms of a disease finally revealing its true nature to a trained diagnostician. The journal's detailed plant drawings, many depicting locations she didn't recognize from her own botanical gathering expeditions. The urgency with which Cull had pursued her debt collection, even before the flood, provided perfect cover for his operations. His casual references to mining claims and territorial development opportunities that seemed to require specific geographical knowledge. "He's not just after my building and property," she said slowly, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "He's pursuing something much larger and more systematic. The sacred burial grounds." Maddow confirmed, his voice heavy with controlled fury that made her glad they were on the same side. "Wiyaka's journal shows precise locations of our most holy places. Plants that grow only in certain mineral-rich soils, water sources that never run dry, even in drought years, caves that maintain constant temperatures throughout the seasons." His voice turned bitter as winter wind. "Everything a man would need to locate valuable mineral deposits hidden beneath the earth, or to systematically desecrate graves while searching for artifacts and precious metals buried with our ancestors." Hazel stared at him, and the full scope of the conspiracy becoming clear in her mind, like puzzle pieces finally clicking into their proper positions. That's why you came to Red Oak. Not simply to reclaim your sister's stolen journal, you're seeking justice for her murder and prevention of further desecration. Justice, yes. But justice accomplished through white legal procedures with proper evidence and witness testimony and courtroom proceedings. Mato's smile held no warmth whatsoever, only the kind of cold determination that made her understand why his people had been such formidable opponents in warfare. Traditional Cheyenne justice for grave robbers and murderers would be much more direct and permanent, and would result in your execution by hanging, which would accomplish nothing except giving them what they want. Almost certainly. But that was my thinking before recent events changed the entire situation. Before what specifically? Mato looked at her for a long measuring moment, and she had the strange feeling he was seeing something in her face that she hadn't consciously put there as some quality or characteristic that had impressed him during their night of shared crisis. Before I met a healer brave enough to tie bell ropes around gun hands when the situation demanded decisive action, he said quietly. Before I found someone else who understands what it means to lose everything important to men like Cole and Archer, and who's willing to fight back despite the odds. His words hung between them, heavy with possibility and danger in equal measure. Hazel found herself thinking about the way they'd worked together during the flood rescue. How their movements had synchronized without planning or discussion, how his presence had made her feel capable of attempting things she would never have considered tackling alone. What exactly are you proposing? She asked her scientific mind, already beginning to analyze the situation, with the same methodical approach she used for complex medical diagnoses. Partnership, Mato said simply, but she could hear the weight of commitment behind the word. You understand this town, these people, the territorial legal system, and how it functions. I know tracking wilderness survival, how to move through hostile territory undetected. Together, we might be able to prove what Archer and Cole are really planning, and prevent them from succeeding. And if we can't prove it through legal channels... Mato's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance, a subtle loosening that reminded her he'd spent most of his adult life as a warrior before becoming a territorial scout, and that violence was simply another tool available for solving problems when other methods failed. Then we make absolutely certain they can't do it to anyone else, he said with quiet finality. That evening, as Red Oak's bedraggled survivors gathered around cooking fires built from salvaged lumber, sharing what food they'd managed to save, and planning for the uncertain days ahead, Hazel made her decision. She found Mato by the river's edge, where he was carefully cleaning mud from his sister's journal, with infinite patience and reverent hands. I'll help you, she said without preamble, her voice carrying the same decisive tone she used when making critical medical decisions. But we approach this intelligently and methodically. No unnecessary violence, no revenge that transforms us into the very thing we're fighting against. Mato looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something like hope kindle in those winter-dark eyes. Agreed completely, he said. But Hazel... The use of her first name sent unexpected warmth through her chest, an intimacy that felt both natural and significant. When the time comes for final confrontation, when we face them with irrefutable evidence of their crimes, you need to understand something crucial about men like Archer. They don't surrender gracefully. They don't admit guilt or show mercy to those who threaten their power and profit. When cornered, they fight with desperate brutality and complete disregard for innocent lives. Then we'd better make absolutely certain we're prepared for that fight when it comes. Hazel replied with quiet determination that surprised her with its intensity. As if summoned by her words, the sound of organized construction reached them from the direction of town. hammering and sawing echoing through the darkness as men worked by flickering lantern light. Looking back toward the settlement, and they could see multiple lights moving in coordinated patterns, evidence of some large-scale project being undertaken despite the late hour. "What are they building?" Hazel asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Auction platform," Mato said quietly, his tone confirming her fears. "Cull's not wasting time with delays or proper legal procedures. He intends to move quickly while people are still disoriented from the disaster." Hazel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain evening air. Tomorrow would bring the reckoning. Cull had promised her shop her livelihood, everything she'd worked to build balanced against his greed and Archer's official authority. But tonight, she had found an ally. Tonight, she had hope flickering like a candle flame in the darkness. And tomorrow, God willing, she would have the beginning of justice. The next 3 days passed in careful, methodical preparation as Hazel and Mato began their investigation into Cull and Archer's operations. Using her knowledge of Red Oak's people and social dynamics, combined with Mato's understanding of tracking and surveillance techniques, they started mapping out their opponent's comprehensive strategy. The pattern that emerged was both systematic and chilling in its scope. Cull had established his operational headquarters in the old Territorial Claims Office, taking full advantage of its stone construction and central location for coordinating activities with Archer's soldiers. From there, he directed the identification of properties suitable for seizure, while using the office's extensive collection of territorial survey maps to plan expeditions into the mountain wilderness. But more troubling was what they observed during their careful surveillance of the building. Supply wagons arrived daily, carrying not just the expected materials for property assessment and legal documentation, but also mining equipment, surveying instruments, and large quantities of provisions suitable for extended wilderness expeditions. They're not waiting for legal cover to be established, Hazel realized as they watched the claims office from concealment behind the ruins of Peterson's grain warehouse. They're moving immediately, while everyone's distracted by flood recovery, and before any federal oversight can be established. "Tomorrow night," Mato confirmed grimly his tracking skills, allowing him to read signs that would have been invisible to her. "I've been monitoring their supply purchases and personnel movements. They're provisioning for at least a week in the mountains, with equipment specifically designed for excavation work." "How do you know all this?" "Because I've been watching them since before the flood, waiting for the right moment to act. The disaster simply accelerated their timeline and gave them legal cover they didn't have before." Mato's expression grew darker. "And because I recognize some of the equipment they're accumulating. Shovels designed for archaeological work boxes for transporting fragile artifacts, even chemicals used for cleaning and preserving metal objects." The implications made Hazel feel sick to her stomach. They weren't just planning to rob graves for whatever valuables might be buried with the dead. They intended to conduct systematic excavation of sacred sites, treating Cheyenne burial grounds like archaeological digs to be strip-mined for profit. "We need evidence," she said, her scientific training demanding proof before action. "But more than that, we need to protect the sacred sites themselves. Once they start digging, any desecration will be permanent and irreversible." "There's someone we need to consult first," Mato agreed. "Someone who might have crucial information we're missing." "Who?" "Dr. Marcus Keene, the physician appointed by the Territorial Court. According to official records, he performed the post-mortem examination on Wiyaka's body. If Archer was involved in covering up her murder, Keene might have evidence we can use." Hazel felt a chill of possibility mixed with dread. And if he was part of the conspiracy from the beginning, then we'll know we can't trust anyone in official authority, and we'll have to handle this ourselves. Mato's tone carried the quiet finality of a man who had considered all possibilities and prepared for the worst outcomes. Dr. Keene lived in a small log cabin 5 miles northeast of Red Oak, far enough from the main settlement to have escaped flood damage, but close enough to respond to medical emergencies when his health permitted. As they rode toward his homestead on horses borrowed from Jonas Pike, who had offered them freely, and once he understood the importance of their mission, Hazel found herself studying Mattow's profile in the afternoon sunlight. "Tell me about your sister," she said, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from growing anxiety about what they might discover. What was she really like beyond her work as a healer? Mattow was quiet for so long that Hazel thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he began to speak in a voice heavy with loss and profound affection. "Wiyaka was 2 years younger than me, but she possessed 3 times my patience and twice my intelligence about things that truly mattered. She could read animal signs in places where I saw nothing but empty ground, could locate water sources during the worst drought conditions, could identify healing plants in the dead of winter, when everything looked identical to untrained eyes." His voice carried the deep love of a brother who had genuinely admired his sibling. She spoke 4 languages, fluently could write in English, better than most territorial officials who'd attended Eastern schools. That journal you saw, it represented her entire life's work, documenting the accumulated healing wisdom of our people for future generations. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was extraordinary in every way that mattered. And she believed deeply in building bridges between our peoples, instead of burning them down, finding ways for Cheyenne and whites to coexist peacefully, instead of fighting the endless wars that were tearing the territory apart. Mattow's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his reins, the only sign of the emotion he was controlling. She thought knowledge could be shared without being stolen, that understanding between cultures could prevent the kind of conflicts that leave children orphaned and families destroyed. Something in his tone made Hazel glance at him more carefully. "You didn't always agree with her approach. I thought she was naive, too trusting of people who saw her knowledge as something to be taken rather than respected." His voice became flat and controlled in a way that suggested old arguments and unresolved guilt. "I wanted her to stay closer to our people, to be more careful about who she trusted with information about our sacred places and traditional practices. But she didn't listen. She listened, but she chose to follow her own path anyway. Said that hiding our knowledge wouldn't preserve it, would just ensure it died with our generation, instead of growing and adapting to new circumstances." Mattow's expression grew darker with memory. "The last time we spoke, I told her she was being foolish, risking everything for people who would never truly accept her or value what she offered. And now you blame yourself for her death." "I blame myself for not being there to protect her when she needed me most," he said with simple honesty that cut deeper than dramatic declarations would have. "But I blame Archer and his people for killing her. I intend to make sure they pay for what they did." Hazel felt her chest tighten with sympathy for his pain, but also with growing determination to help him find the justice he sought. "What would she want you to do now?" "Find the truth. Protect what can still be protected. Make sure her work wasn't completely wasted." He glanced at her then, and she saw something that might have been hope flickering behind the grief. Maybe build some of those bridges she believed in, if there are still people worth building them with. Dr. Keene's cabin sat nestled in a grove of towering pine trees, smoke rising from its stone chimney in a thin gray line against the afternoon sky. As they approached, Hazel could see the physician working slowly in his herb garden, moving with the careful deliberation of chronic illness among rows of carefully tended medicinal plants. Marcus Keene was perhaps 55 years old, with the kind of pale indoor complexion that spoke of too much time spent over medical texts and too little proper nutrition or outdoor exercise. When he looked up at their approach, His eyes held the distant, slightly unfocused quality of someone managing constant pain, but also something else, a flicker of recognition, and what might have been guilt. "Miss Pritchard," he said, straightening with obvious effort that cost him considerable discomfort. "I heard about the flood through the Territorial Medical Network. Terrible business all around. Are you injured? Do you need medical assistance?" "No, Dr. Keene, but I need to ask you about something extremely sensitive and potentially dangerous." Hazel dismounted and moved to help steady the older man as he swayed slightly on his feet. "About a post-mortem examination you performed on a Cheyenne woman 2 winters ago." Keene's face went very still, what little color he'd possessed draining away completely. "I've examined many people over the years, Miss Pritchard. The frontier can be a harsh and dangerous place. Could you be more specific about which particular case?" "Wiyaka Red Hawk," Mato said, quietly dismounting and moving to stand beside Hazel with the kind of controlled intensity that made the air seem to thicken around them. "My sister." The remaining color fled from Keene's face, entirely leaving him looking like a man who just received news of his own death sentence. Yes, I remember that case very clearly. Tragic situation, animal predation, according to my official findings." "That's what your written report concluded." Mato agreed, his voice dangerously quiet, in a way that suggested violence was only barely held in check. "But I'm wondering if you'd like to revise that assessment now that we're speaking privately." Keene looked between them, clearly struggling with some profound internal conflict that went far beyond simple professional ethics. His hands were shaking now, and Hazel could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool mountain air. Finally, he gestured toward his cabin, with a gesture that seemed to cost him tremendous effort. "Perhaps we should discuss this matter inside away from potential observation by others." The cabin's interior proved to be neat, but sparse, lined with medical texts and anatomical drawings that spoke of serious professional dedication despite his current physical limitations. Keene moved to his desk with careful steps and withdrew a thick folder from a locked drawer, his hands shaking noticeably as he opened it to reveal detailed documentation. "Your sister's case," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've reviewed these findings many times since writing the initial report, wondering if I should have been more thorough in my investigation." "And what conclusions have you reached?" Hazel prompted gently, using the kind of tone she'd learned was most effective with frightened patients. "I should have been more thorough in my examination. Should have asked harder questions, demanded more time for proper investigation, refused to be rushed or pressured into premature conclusions." Keene pulled out a series of detailed sketches showing wound patterns and trauma analysis. The injuries were superficially consistent with animal attack, but the specific pattern and distribution were highly unusual. Mato studied the drawings with professional interest, born of years spent tracking both animals and men across dangerous territory. How unusual exactly? Predators typically attack the throat and major arteries, seeking quick kills to minimize their own risk and energy expenditure. But your sister's wounds were primarily concentrated on her hands and forearms, classic defensive injuries, indicating she fought off human attackers rather than wild animals. Why didn't you include that crucial observation in your official report? Keene's voice became very small, and ashamed, the words seeming to cost him physical pain to speak. Because Sergeant Archer was present throughout the entire examination process. He made it abundantly clear that any finding other than animal predation would be problematic for territorial stability. Said the authorities didn't want panic about Indian killers or white vigilante groups spreading through the settlements and disrupting the peace. So you deliberately falsified official medical findings to support a predetermined conclusion. Maddow said with flat accusation that left no room for self-justification. I focused on evidence that supported the official narrative, while omitting contradictory findings that might cause complications. I told myself I was preventing broader violence, maintaining peace between the communities that were already suspicious of each other. Keene met Maddow's eyes with visible effort, and Hazel could see the shame eating at him like a physical disease. But the truth is, I was simply a coward who chose personal safety over professional integrity and justice for the dead. Hazel felt a mixture of disappointment and understanding wash over her. Keene was fundamentally a decent man who had been placed in an impossible situation, pressured by military authority, to suppress evidence that might have led to justice for Wiyaka, while preventing him from doing his job properly. "Is there anything else?" she asked hopefully. "Any additional evidence that might help us prove what really happened to her?" Keene hesitated for a long moment, internal conflict playing out across his features like shadows cast by flickering firelight. Then he reached deeper into the folder, with hands that had steadied slightly, as if coming to a difficult decision had brought him some measure of peace. "I kept tissue samples and physical evidence," he said quietly. "Standard medical practice for suspicious deaths, but I never mentioned their existence to Sergeant Archer or anyone else in official authority." He produced a small glass vial containing what looked like threads of fabric in various colors and textures. "These were embedded under your sister's fingernails, indicating she fought back hard against her attackers. Wool fibers dyed with a specific shade of blue that's distinctive to military uniforms, manufactured specifically for territorial cavalry units." Maddow's breath hissed between his teeth with the sound of a man receiving confirmation of his worst suspicions. "She fought them." "It certainly appears so based on the physical evidence. And there's additional material that supports that conclusion." Keene pulled out another vial, this one containing what looked like small metal shavings and fragments. "These were embedded in the soil around her gravesite, indicating someone used metal digging tools rather than just hands or wooden implements to disturb the burial." "Army entrenching tools," Hazel said, immediately recognizing the distinctive marks from her experience treating soldiers who'd been injured during construction work. "Standard issue equipment for cavalry patrols operating in potentially hostile territory." "That would be my professional assessment as well, yes?" Keene closed the folder carefully and met their eyes directly for the first time since they'd arrived. "I can't provide official testimony in any legal proceeding. Archer would have me stripped of my medical license and probably face criminal charges for withholding evidence. But if you can find another way to present this information to proper authorities..." "We'll find a way," Maddow said quietly, but with absolute conviction that made Hazel believe he would move mountains if necessary to achieve justice for his sister. "Dr. Keene, this information means more than you can possibly understand." As they prepared to leave, Keene caught Hazel's arm with surprising strength, his grip urgent despite his obvious physical weakness. "Be extremely careful, Miss Pritchard. Whatever scheme Archer and his associates are implementing, it extends far beyond covering up one murder. Men don't take risks of this magnitude unless the potential profits are enormous, and the consequences of exposure would be catastrophic." The ride back toward Red Oak passed in thoughtful silence, both of them processing the implications of what they had learned while watching the sun sink lower toward the western peaks. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, but as Keene had pointed out, they needed a method to present it that couldn't be suppressed or dismissed by corrupt authority. "The territorial marshal," Hazel said as they approached the town's outskirts and could see smoke rising from the cooking fires of survivors. "When he finally arrives to investigate the emergency situation, we present everything simultaneously. The financial records, Keene's physical evidence, witness testimony about the journal theft. If he's honest, Maddow replied grimly, his expression suggesting he'd had extensive experience with dishonest officials. If he's not already purchased or intimidated into cooperation with their scheme. It was a sobering thought that chilled her more than the mountain evening air. How deep did the corruption extend through territorial government? How many officials had been bought, blackmailed, or simply frightened into silence over the years? As they topped the last hill before Red Oak, they could see significant new activity throughout the settlement that hadn't been there when they'd left that morning. More soldiers had arrived during their absence, and a large military tent had been erected near the courthouse ruins. Smoke rose from multiple cooking fires, and the sound of organized construction work carried clearly on the evening air. They're accelerating their timeline dramatically, Hazel observed with growing alarm. Whatever they're planning, it's happening much sooner than we anticipated. Tomorrow night, Maddow said with grim certainty that came from years of reading military preparations. They move tomorrow night, while the moon is dark and most people are still focused on their own recovery efforts. That evening, they held a strategy meeting in the ruins of Hazel's apothecary, gathering what allies they could trust with such dangerous information. Thomas Brennan had found them with news that made their blood run cold, his young face pale with fear and determination in equal measure. "Miss Pritchard," he said urgently, keeping his voice low despite their isolation. "I overheard Cull talking to Archer near their headquarters. They're not just planning one expedition into the mountains. They're organizing multiple simultaneous operations using your sister's journal to guide them to the richest burial grounds throughout the entire region." "How many sites are they targeting?" Maddow asked sharply, his warrior's mind immediately grasping the strategic implications. "At least 4, maybe 5 different locations. They're dividing their men into separate teams to hit all the sites at once before anyone can organize resistance or alert territorial authorities." Thomas swallowed hard before continuing with the worst news. "And they're taking you with them, Miss Pritchard. Cull said they need someone who can read the botanical markers in the journal, identify the specific locations from your sister's plant drawings." Hazel felt ice crystallize in her veins as the full implications hit her. "Taking me how?" "By force if necessary. They're planning to grab you tonight before you can cause more trouble or disappear into the wilderness where they can't find you." Maddow was already moving toward the door, his hand dropping automatically to his knife. "We need to leave immediately. This location is compromised." But as they prepared to slip away into the darkness, lantern lights suddenly surrounded the ruined building from all sides. Sergeant Archer stepped into view with 6 armed soldiers, all carrying rifles and positioned to prevent any escape attempt. "Miss Pritchard," Archer said with cold formality that somehow sounded more threatening than shouted anger would have. "Mr. Cull would like to have a word with you about a business proposition that will be mutually beneficial." "I have nothing to say to Cull that hasn't already been said." "I'm afraid it's not a request this time." Archer nodded to his men with military precision. "Secure them both for transport. Use whatever force is necessary, but try to avoid permanent damage. We need them functional for the work ahead." The soldiers moved forward with practiced efficiency that spoke of experience in this kind of operation. Maddow's hand moved toward his knife, but Archer's voice stopped him before he could draw the weapon. "I wouldn't recommend resistance Indian. My men have specific orders to shoot at the first sign of trouble, and I'd hate for Miss Pritchard to be injured in the crossfire of your poor judgment." Hazel stepped forward before Maddow could act on the violence she could see building in his posture. "I'll come voluntarily, but leave him out of this. He's done nothing except try to help flood victims." "Oh, he's very much part of this operation now," Archer said with cold satisfaction that suggested he'd been looking forward to this moment. "Mr. Cull has very specific plans for both of you, and your cooperation will determine how pleasant your immediate future becomes. They were bound with rope and loaded onto horses, with the efficient brutality of professional soldiers, then taken through the darkness toward the mountains, along trails that wound higher into the wilderness with each passing mile. The ride took hours, following paths that seemed designed to confuse anyone trying to track their passage, until they finally reached a hidden canyon where Cull had established a comprehensive base camp. The operation was far more extensive than either Hazel or Maddow had imagined. The canyon contained not just temporary shelters and supply storage, but sophisticated mining equipment, surveying instruments, and even a portable assay furnace for testing ore samples. Dozens of men moved through the camp with purposeful efficiency, and she could see that this had been planned and prepared for months, possibly years. "Welcome to my enterprise, Miss Pritchard," Cull said as they were brought before his tent, which had been furnished with the kind of luxury items that spoke of a man who intended to enjoy his criminality in comfort. The land speculator looked entirely different now, no longer the polished businessman, but something harder and more dangerous, a predator finally able to drop his civilized mask. "I trust you'll find the accommodations adequate for your unfortunately brief stay with us." "What do you want from us?" Hazel demanded, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Your expertise, naturally. You see, while that journal contains excellently detailed drawings, the precise locations are marked in symbols that only someone familiar with both botanical identification and Cheyenne cultural traditions can properly interpret." Cull gestured toward Maddow with casual contempt. "Unfortunately, our friend here seems disinclined to provide voluntary cooperation. But you, with your medical knowledge and scientific understanding of plant identification, might prove more reasonable when properly motivated. I won't help you desecrate sacred burial grounds for profit." "Oh, but you will," Cull said with the kind of cold certainty that made her understand he'd planned for every contingency. "Because if you don't provide the assistance we require, I'll have Sergeant Archer demonstrate exactly what happened to the journal's previous owner using techniques that will be considerably more thorough than what your Cheyenne friend experienced." Archer stepped forward with obvious anticipation, and for the first time since she'd met him, Hazel saw something beyond cold professionalism in his expression. Something personal, and filled with a hatred that went far deeper than simple greed or military duty. "You see, Miss Pritchard," Archer said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of intimate menace that was more terrifying than shouted threats. "That Cheyenne woman wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was actively interfering with an operation that's been years in the planning, a systematic survey and exploitation of mineral deposits hidden throughout these mountains." "The burial grounds," Maddow said, understanding dawning in his voice, despite his own precarious situation. "Precisely correct. Your people chose those sites because the earth was sacred to them, because certain geological features made them spiritually significant, according to your primitive beliefs." Archer's eyes glittered with the kind of avarice that transformed men into monsters. "But we've discovered through careful investigation that sacred earth happens to sit atop some of the richest mineral veins in the entire territory. Gold, silver, copper, even some rare metals that Eastern collectors will pay premium prices to obtain. So, you killed my sister for a treasure map that would lead you to graves you could rob. I killed your sister because she was systematically documenting sites we'd already surveyed and claimed for development, and her journal would have exposed our entire operation to territorial authorities who might have interfered with legitimate business operations." Archer's voice carried no remorse whatsoever, only the cold calculation of a man who viewed murder as simply another business expense. "She fought much harder than we expected for someone so small, but the final result was never really in doubt." Hazel felt physically sick as the casual brutality of his confession sank in. "You're both completely insane if you think the territorial government will allow systematic desecration of Native American burial sites for commercial mining operations. The territorial government will never know what actually happened here," Cull said with smooth confidence that suggested he'd already planned for official oversight. "By the time anyone with authority investigates these locations, the sites will appear to have been disturbed by perfectly natural causes. Landslides, perhaps, or animal predation, or simple erosion from weather patterns. Any artifacts we recover will be sold through private collectors in eastern cities far from territorial oversight and investigation. What about the mineral rights themselves? You can't just claim mining territory without proper legal documentation, already filed and approved through carefully placed bribes and forged documentation that will stand up to reasonable scrutiny. Once we've cleared the burial sites and established legitimate mining claims, everything becomes perfectly legal under territorial law." Cull's expression grew sharp with anticipation and greed. "Now, Miss Pritchard, shall we begin your education in practical botanical identification for commercial purposes?" They were taken to a cleared area where Wiyaka's journal lay open on a makeshift table surrounded by survey maps, mining equipment, and what looked like archaeological tools designed for careful excavation work. Cull pointed to a particular page showing detailed plant drawings alongside traditional symbols that she now understood represented sacred sites. "These markings here," he said, indicating specific symbols with the tip of a silver letter opener, "correspond to landmarks we've already identified through our preliminary surveys. But we need someone who can read the botanical clues to pinpoint exact locations where the most valuable artifacts and mineral deposits are likely to be found." Hazel studied the page with growing horror, her scientific mind automatically beginning to interpret the detailed drawings even as her conscience rebelled against using that knowledge. The illustrations were indeed brilliantly precise, showing not just individual plants, but their relationships to each other and to specific geographical features. It was comprehensive documentation that would have taken years to compile, representing Wiyaka's entire life's work as a healer and keeper of traditional knowledge. "I won't help you," she said firmly, meeting Cull's gaze with as much defiance as she could muster. Cull nodded to Archer with casual inevitability, and the sergeant struck Matto across the face with calculated brutality. The blow sent the Cheyenne man staggering, blood streaming from his split lip and what looked like a broken nose. "That was gentle," Archer said conversationally, flexing his knuckles as if preparing for more serious violence. "The next demonstration will be considerably less restrained, and we have several hours before we need to depart for the burial sites." "Stop," Hazel said quickly, her medical training making her acutely aware of how much damage Archer could inflict without causing death. I'll examine the journal, but I won't guarantee I can interpret everything correctly." "Oh, I think you'll find your comprehension quite adequate when properly motivated," Cull said with obvious satisfaction at his successful coercion. For the next hour, Hazel was forced to study the journal under constant threat of violence to Matto. But as she worked, she began to understand something crucial that Cull and Archer had completely missed. The symbols weren't just marking burial sites for their convenience. They were creating a comprehensive map of the entire region's sacred geography, including defensive positions and escape routes that her captors didn't recognize as such. More importantly, she realized that Wiyaka had been far more clever than anyone suspected. The final pages of the journal contained additional information written in what appeared to be decorative plant borders, but which her trained eye recognized as a sophisticated code that documented illegal activities the healer had witnessed during her gathering expeditions. "This section here," Hazel said carefully, pointing to what appeared to be ornamental drawings while catching Matto's attention with subtle eye contact. "These aren't simple botanical illustrations. They're detailed documentation of surveying activities, equipment movements, even what appear to be personnel records and financial transactions. Cull leaned forward with sharp interest, his greed overcoming his caution. Personnel records of what kind? Names, dates, locations of illegal activities. Your sister was recording everything she observed. Hazel told Maddow, hoping he would understand her true meaning while appearing to cooperate with their captors, including detailed documentation of activities that would interest federal territorial authorities investigating violations of treaty rights and territorial law. Maddow's eyes sharpened with comprehension despite his injuries. She was building a legal case. Legal evidence of what exactly? Archer demanded, his voice carrying the first note of uncertainty she'd heard from him. Systematic violation of tribal treaty rights, illegal mineral surveys on protected lands, conspiracy to commit grave robbery, and artifact theft, probably several counts of murder if she witnessed other incidents. Hazel met Archer's gaze directly, allowing him to see her growing confidence. Everything you've been doing for the past several years, documented in detail by someone who understood both your language and the legal implications of your activities. The silence that followed was heavy with implication and growing dread. Finally, Cull spoke, his voice deadly quiet, in a way that made her understand their situation had just become infinitely more dangerous. How much potentially incriminating information does that journal actually contain? Everything, Maddow said with grim satisfaction despite his precarious circumstances. Wiyako was trained by our elders to be a keeper of knowledge and cultural memory. She would have recorded every detail, every crime she witnessed, every name and face of people involved in illegal activities. Then we have a serious problem. Archer said, his military mind immediately grasping the strategic implications. Because if that information ever reaches territorial authorities or federal investigators, it won't, Cull said with the kind of finality that left no room for negotiation or mercy. We eliminate all the witnesses, destroy any potentially incriminating evidence, and proceed with our original operational plan. The potential profits are too enormous to abandon now, regardless of complications. What about the mining rights and legal documentation you've already filed? Will stand up to scrutiny perfectly well as long as there's no evidence of how we originally obtained the location information or witness testimony about our methods. Cull's expression hardened with ruthless resolve. Which means Miss Pritchard and her Indian friend have unfortunately become permanent liabilities that need to be resolved before we can proceed safely. Hazel felt her heart racing as the full implications became crystal clear. They weren't just planning to rob graves and steal artifacts. They were planning to commit multiple murders to cover their tracks and ensure their crimes could never be exposed. You can't simply make us disappear without consequences, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. People in Red Oak know where we went and who we were investigating. People in Red Oak think you fled in the night to avoid your debts and legal obligations. Archer replied with cold amusement. A perfectly reasonable assumption given your recent financial difficulties. And if your bodies are eventually discovered in these remote mountains, well, the wilderness can be extremely dangerous for inexperienced travelers who venture into hostile territory without proper preparation. Enough discussion, Cull said impatiently, his greed clearly overriding any remaining caution. We have work to accomplish before dawn, and daylight will make movement more difficult. Miss Pritchard will guide us to the exact locations marked in the journal, and then we'll resolve our security concerns permanently. They were bound more securely and placed under heavy guard for what remained of the night, but as the camp gradually settled into the kind of quiet that comes before dawn, in operations, Maddow began working at his restraints with the patient determination of someone whose life had often depended on escaping from impossible situations. Hours passed with agonizing slowness before he managed to loosen his bonds enough to free his hands using techniques that suggested extensive experience with rope work and captivity. Once his hands were free, he carefully untied Hazel's restraints, while keeping watch for guards and maintaining the appearance of helpless captivity. "Can you move quietly?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, even in the pre-dawn stillness. "I've had practice moving silently through hospital wards at night," she replied, understanding that their lives now depended on skills neither of them had expected to need when they'd begun this investigation. Finally, both were free of their bonds, but escape from the camp would require crossing open ground under the watchful eyes of sentries, and they had no weapons except what they could improvise from available materials and their own knowledge. "The journal," Mato whispered urgently. "We need to retrieve it before we attempt escape." "Why, you've already seen what's in it, and carrying it will only slow us down." "Because I was wrong about what Wiyaka recorded. If she truly documented their crimes the way you described, there might be information we can use to destroy them completely, even if we don't survive to testify." His expression grew grimmer in the faint starlight. "And because burning it would eliminate the evidence they need to locate the burial sites. Without those precise plant markers, they'll never find the sacred grounds." They crept through the sleeping camp with infinite care, avoiding sentries and moving between tents like shadows cast by the dying embers of cook fires. Cull's tent was guarded, but the table where the journal lay was partially concealed behind supply crates and equipment storage. Hazel used her medical knowledge of pressure points and nerve clusters to render the nearest guard unconscious without causing permanent harm, while Mato retrieved the journal and gathered what supplies they could carry. She also managed to collect basic medical supplies from their stores, knowing they would need everything possible for the ordeal ahead. "Now what?" she whispered as they prepared to flee into the wilderness. "Now we make them pay for every life they've destroyed," Mato replied grimly, tucking the journal securely inside his shirt. "But first, we have to survive long enough to bring them to justice." They slipped away from the camp as quietly as mountain mist, but their absence was discovered within an hour when the guard shifts changed. Soon, lantern light was moving through the darkness in organized search patterns as multiple parties spread out to find them before they could escape or alert outside authorities. The chase that followed tested every skill Hazel had learned during her years of frontier medicine and Mato's lifetime of wilderness survival. They were pursued through terrain that ranged from treacherous rocky slopes to dense forest, where every step had to be carefully placed to avoid detection. "Where are we going?" Hazel gasped as they climbed yet another steep incline covered with loose shale that threatened to give way beneath their feet. "Sacred ground," Mato replied, his breathing steady despite their exertion. "The first burial site they plan to desecrate. If we can reach it before dawn, we might be able to use the terrain features to our advantage." "How will that help us against armed men with military training? The burial sites weren't chosen randomly by our ancestors. They're naturally defensive positions, places where small numbers can hold off larger forces if they understand the geography and fight intelligently." His expression grew fierce with ancestral pride. "Our people were warriors long before they were forced to become peaceful, and they chose their sacred grounds with both spiritual and practical considerations in mind." Behind them, voices were getting closer despite their best efforts at concealment. Lantern light flickered between trees, and occasionally they could hear Archer shouting orders to his men with the kind of professional coordination that suggested extensive experience in this type of pursuit operation. "They're gaining on us." Hazel observed her medical training, allowing her to assess their physical condition and estimate how much longer they could maintain this pace. "Then we make our stand at the next defensible position." Mato decided, studying the terrain ahead with tactical assessment. They had reached a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon below, with stone walls on either side, providing natural fortification and only one practical approach route. "This location offers good fields of fire and limited avenues of attack. We can hold them here until help arrives. What help? Nobody knows where we are or what's happened to us. Dr. Keene promised to contact federal authorities if we disappeared. If he kept his word and acted quickly, cavalry from Fort Garland might already be en route. Mattow's expression suggested he was prepared for the possibility that no help would come. But even if we're on our own, we have advantages they don't expect. Such as, we have truth on our side and we have each other. He said with quiet conviction that somehow made her believe they might actually survive this nightmare. And we have something they want more than our lives. As if summoned by his words, Cull's voice echoed up from the canyon below, carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. Miss Pritchard, Mr. Red Hawk, there's nowhere left to run. Surrender now, and I guarantee your deaths will be quick and relatively painless. Generous offer, Hazel muttered, checking her improvised medical supplies and preparing what defenses she could from their meager resources. They have to climb up here to reach us, Mattow observed, studying the narrow path that represented their attackers' only approach route. And this ledge is barely wide enough for two people to stand side by side. If we can hold them at the narrowest point, what happens when our improvised weapons run out and they simply overwhelm us through superior numbers? Then we've at least made sure Wiyaka's journal survives to tell the truth about what they did. Mattow said with the kind of calm acceptance that comes from facing death with purpose. But I don't intend to die easily. The first assault came just as the eastern horizon began showing the faintest hint of dawn. Two of Archer's men attempted to climb the treacherous path in darkness, relying on stealth and surprise to reach their position undetected. What followed was brutal close-quarters fighting under conditions that tested every skill both Hazel and Mattow possessed. His knife work proved efficient and deadly, but he couldn't defend every approach simultaneously. When one soldier managed to get past his guard and attacked Hazel with drawn sword, she discovered that her medical knowledge of human anatomy could be applied to more than healing. Her improvised scalpel, crafted from broken glass and surgical knowledge, found the attacker's wrist tendons with surgical precision, severing the muscles that controlled his sword hand and sending him screaming into the darkness below. Impressive work for a healer, Mattow observed with grim approval, wiping blood from his knife blade. I know where all the important parts are located, Hazel replied, surprised by her own steady nerves under such extreme circumstances. But their position, while defensible, was ultimately hopeless against determined attackers with superior numbers and equipment. More men were climbing the cliff face despite the casualties, and it was only a matter of time before sheer persistence overcame their tactical advantages. Then, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the approaching dawn, and the unmistakable sound of many horses echoing through the canyon reached their ears. The steady rhythm of iron-shod hooves moving at military pace, accompanied by the jingle of cavalry equipment, and shouted commands in voices that carried federal authority. Cavalry patrol, Mattow said with amazement and relief. Keene actually kept his promise and contacted Fort Garland. The arrival of federal troops changed the entire tactical situation in minutes. Archer's men, caught in the act of assaulting civilians and conducting illegal operations on federal territory, had no choice but to surrender or face charges of treason, in addition to their other crimes. Cull attempted to flee through a back trail he'd prepared for such emergencies, but was captured within 2 miles of the base camp by cavalry scouts who knew the terrain better than his guides. As the dust settled and prisoners were properly secured with military efficiency, Marshal Clayton Ross himself approached the ledge where Hazel and Mattow had made their desperate stand. Miss Pritchard, Mr. Red Hawk. He called up with professional respect and obvious relief at finding them alive. Are you seriously injured? Do you need immediate medical attention? We're alive and functional." Hazel called back, though she could feel exhaustion and reaction beginning to set in now that the immediate danger had passed. "That's considerably more than I expected an hour ago." "Well, come down when you're ready and able to travel safely. We have some very serious federal charges to file, and your testimony will be absolutely crucial to ensuring these criminals face justice for their crimes." The trials that followed made headlines throughout the Western Territories and beyond, establishing legal precedents that would protect Native American cultural sites for generations to come. Archer and Cull were convicted on multiple counts of murder conspiracy, grave robbery fraud, and violation of federal treaty obligations. The evidence from Wiyaka's journal proved even more comprehensive than anyone had imagined, documenting a network of corruption that reached deep into territorial government and military command structures. More importantly, for the future, the case established legal frameworks for protecting Native American burial sites and cultural artifacts, ensuring that the kind of systematic desecration Archer and Cull had planned could never again be conducted with legal impunity. But for Hazel and Maddow, the most significant outcome was deeply personal rather than legal or political. Standing together in her rebuilt apothecary 8 months later, watching Red Oak's continued recovery and growth into something stronger than it had been before the flood, Hazel reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying night in the bell tower when she'd first encountered the man who had become the most important person in her life. "Any regrets about the path we chose?" Maddow asked, noting her thoughtful expression as she organized supplies that now included traditional Cheyenne remedies alongside her conventional medical treatments. "None whatsoever," she said with absolute conviction. "We did what needed to be done, regardless of the personal cost. Justice was served, and innocent people were protected from future harm." "Speaking of justice," Maddow said, reaching into his shirt to withdraw a familiar leather journal, "I have something that belongs to you now." Hazel looked at Wiyaka's journal with surprise and profound emotion. "I thought that was being held as evidence in the federal investigation." It was. But the court proceedings are finished, and the federal judge ruled it should be returned to the tribe for proper cultural preservation. The tribal council met and decided unanimously that you should be its guardian. Maddow held it out to her with ceremonial reverence. "They believe you'll use it the way Wiyaka intended, to heal rather than harm, to build bridges rather than walls between our peoples." Hazel accepted the journal with hands that trembled slightly from the weight of responsibility rather than physical weakness. "I won't let her work be forgotten or misused. I promise you that." "I know you won't. Just as I know she would have approved completely of what we accomplished together and what we've built from the ashes of tragedy." Maddow's expression softened with something that went far deeper than simple partnership or professional respect. She believed in the power of knowledge shared between peoples, healing that transcends cultural boundaries, justice that serves everyone rather than just the powerful. "What we built," Hazel repeated thoughtfully, testing the words and finding them accurate. "Yes, I think that's exactly right. We built something worth preserving." "So, what happens now?" Maddow asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Now we continue the work. Together." Hazel moved to the window, looking out at Red Oak's bustling streets, where Cheyenne and white families now shopped side by side, where her medical practice served both communities with equal dedication, where the future looked brighter than anyone had dared hope during those dark days after the flood. There are still wounds that need healing, still bridges that need building, still justice that needs protecting. As if to illustrate her point, a young Cheyenne woman appeared in the apothecary's doorway, clearly in the advanced stages of pregnancy and seeking medical care without the fear or suspicion that had once made such visits nearly impossible. "Please," she said in careful English, her hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. I need help. The baby comes soon, and there are complications. Hazel was already reaching for her medical supplies before the woman finished speaking her professional instincts, taking over automatically. But she paused to look back at Maddo, who was preparing to assist with the quiet competence she'd come to rely on. Absolutely. Partners, she asked, as she had so many times during their months of working together. Partners, he confirmed with absolute certainty, his voice carrying all the weight of shared trials, mutual respect, and something deeper that had grown between them through hardship and danger and triumph. And as they worked together to bring new life safely into the world, Hazel knew with complete certainty that some battles were worth fighting not for victory itself, but for the chance to build something better in their aftermath. Some partnerships were forged in crisis, but tempered by justice, proven by sacrifice, and strengthened by the knowledge that they had chosen to stand together when it would have been easier and safer to stand apart. The sun set over Red Oak that evening with golden light that seemed to promise even better days ahead. In the distance, the mountains stood eternal and watchful, their peaks touched with snow that would melt come spring to nourish the valley below and sustain the communities that had learned to live together in peace. It was a good place to heal, a good place to build bridges that would last, a good place to prove that justice, however delayed or difficult to achieve, could still prevail when good people found the courage to stand together against darkness and corruption. And in the end, when all the trials were finished and all the criminals had been brought to account, that knowledge was enough to build a future on.